Hello, folks. I'm Andy Oliver, the Minister of Pastoral Care here at Portland First United Methodist Church in the heart of Portland, Oregon. You may not know this, but our senior pastor is retiring after 40 years of ministry, the last 10 of which has been here in Portland. There's been a lot of thinking and planning that's gone into this transition. We're going to have an interim senior pastor for 6 months before the new senior pastor begins their ministry this coming July. That's how United Methodist churches receive pastors or get pastors. The bishop of each of the geographical areas known as conferences, we live in the Oregon-Idaho Conference, appoint all the pastors within that conference. This time around, for the first time in 173 years that this church has been in existence, for the first time in the history of appointments to this church, the bishop has announced that she's committed to First Portland being an inclusive church and will intentionally seek a Black, Indigenous, or person of color to be the next senior pastor. For the first time, the senior pastor may not be white. The bishop has bent over backwards to say that she's seeking the best candidate to fit this congregation and that there is a commitment to deliberately consider a person of color. For 173 years, only white people got to be the senior pastor of the largest United Methodist church in the state of Oregon. I do not know if there have been very many white congregants who have complained about this. But think of it, from before the Civil War, through the abolition of slavery, through Reconstruction, and then the horrors of Jim Crow, through the tumultuous struggle of the Civil Rights era, and the over half a century following the passage of the Voting Rights Act and other cornerstone policies to end discrimination, to decade after decade after decade of people of color breaking through barriers in this country, right up to the Black Lives Matter movement, never, not once, in all this time, did this church ever intentionally seek to have a non-white senior pastor. Nor was there ever a major upheaval from amongst the congregation when white pastor after white pastor was appointed through the years. Only white people got to be the senior pastor. That's called a privilege, when one group is favored over all other groups, even if no one talks about it, notices it, or means for it to be. A privilege that was granted exclusively to white people. It's not like there weren't people from other races qualified to be the senior pastor. The United Methodist Church stretches all over the world and has since its inception in the late 1700s. In fact, United Methodist churches in Africa and the Philippines have been exploding with growth for decades, while during that same period of time, white North American churches have been in decline. And yet, only white people were appointed, as if not a single person of color had the gifts and graces to serve this church. If that's an expression of white privilege, it doesn't matter what the intent was, it matters what the action was, what actually happened. And now things might change. What an exciting time. How many things will be different for us if we looked at God or looked at the world partnered through the leadership of someone who's not white? Now, some might complain and say that that's not fair to white people, that the bishop is deliberately seeking someone who can fit the diversity fits the diversity this church claims that it wants. But after 173 years of only white people, it's hard for me to see unfairness at play against white people. It's hard for me to see how white people who have had such privilege for such a long time are being treated unfairly. Should a person of color be the next senior pastor, I think the white people will be okay. And by okay, I mean we'll have our privileges challenged and torn down, but this is necessary and faithful for us to be Christ's people. And Jesus will be with us on this journey. You know, it turns out that there's another part of the history of Portland First United Methodist Church. It turns out that this church has a history of breaking barriers and embracing diversity. It was a bishop who over 10 years ago appointed the very first woman senior pastor to our church. After 163 years of only men being able or allowed to serve as senior pastor, which by the way is called male privilege, a woman was finally appointed. And let me tell you a secret. It turned out okay for men. Some of our sexism was torn down, But it turns out I wasn't that unfair to the men after all. And even earlier than having a woman senior pastor, this church became a reconciling congregation, embracing LGBTQ folks, and we even had a gay senior pastor. And you know what? It turned out okay for all the straight people, though some of our homophobia was challenged. This is the congregation that has a history of diversity and embracing change. We have done this hard work before, and it is on the shoulders of our ancestors in the faith who had the courage to see the grace of God at work in all aspects of this human race. It came with struggle and wasn't easy, and it won't be easy for us in the future. It'll be hard for white people like me and to acknowledge and no longer insist on white privilege. As a congregation, we'll have to address the racism that we do not notice, the racism that comes out in the name of wanting the best for our church. Because let me tell you another secret, it's not our church. It turns out the church belongs to Jesus, and he's rather fond of the whole human race. For the Prince of Peace has come to bring light to all who sit in hopelessness. Amen.